and becoming a source for news than ever before. So I think you're seeing. I think this is just is about the changing dynamic of the cost of producing news, the cost of people having it on the ground, the cost of publishing it, the cost of distributing it. I mean, most newspapers spend almost 70% of their revenue pulping trees and printing things on paper that is like done at the end of the day, right? Not even. Within hours of it coming off the presses, and so I think that the trend for a wide variety of institutions like the White House to be producing and creating news, although maybe we'd argue about how much of it actually is news versus other things. But I think it's been kind of a natural consequence of the broad impact of digital technologies, from the cost of video cameras to the cost of distribution.
Did you get your answer?
Well, if I may, I want to try to answer it more directly as I understand your question. From my perspective, there's a difference between advocacy journalism and a kind of journalism that is the kind that I tried to practice at the New York Times and is imperfect, but it was calculated to be not advocacy, but something that was, to the extent possible, objective, a concept that I actually believe is something you can strive for and should strive for. I think the point is that the world that we are moving rapidly toward is one in which advocacy is effectively, calculated to be both news and certainly it's entwined. And it's not just Human Rights Watch. It's, governments like in China and like in the White House. It is effectively an effort to manufacture something that is going to be perceived as honest and dispassionate and authoritatively true and fair and so forth, which may or may not be. But it's something that it's not just Human Rights Watch that does this. The National Rifle Association does this, and the military does this, and corporations do this. BP. Look at BP has now got its own, essentially, news organization going, and they give their version of what news is, and that is fine, but that's not what I want an institution whose professional standards say we're not supposed to take the press release and print it. We're supposed to do our own work.
Because of time, Sam, you have the last word, or the last question. It's a lot of power.
I planned it that way.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Sam Burness family member. Mr. Jones, very proud. Mr. Jones, you raised the point that a reader of the New York Times cover to cover would spend 45 minutes.
No, I said I spend about 30 to 45 minutes. And I think that statistics have shown that most people who get it on paper spend, 30 minutes or so. Okay.
And you compared that to someone at NewYorkTimes.com who would spend 5 minutes, and it seemed to me that what you're implying was the person at NewYorkTimes.com gets a less robust news experience. And it struck me as a bit of an unfair comparison, because the New York Times is really a collection of websites. It's a domestic news. I mean, in the New York Times, there's domestic news, international news, a metro section, a style section, a sports section, an opinion section. So if I spend 5 minutes at NewYorkTimes.com and 5 minutes at ESPN.com and 5 minutes at Slate.com and 5 minutes at my favorite NewYorkFoodBlog.com, then how is my news experience any less robust?
I think that that's a fair question, and I think the issue is a matter of habit and how you go about, apportioning your day and your time. I think the fact is that the web allows you to pursue those exact, the team you want, the food you want, the interests of international politics that you want. Reading the New York Times on paper is much more random. It's not, you don't go someplace for something. something, you have a sort of an array of choices, and your eye scans the paper. So they've found that, the human eye going from right to left across a spread of a newspaper and so forth. I mean, you look at headlines, you find things, you turn the page. My particular way of reading the New York Times, I look at the front page, and I go to the op-ed page. And then I read it from the A section, from back to front, then whatever. But I mean, my point is that not that you can't be just as well informed or vastly more informed from the web than you can from the New York Times. There's, you could go to 25 websites, news websites on the web, but that's not the way most people tend to be. They've got a relatively small number of places they always go, and the New York Times site may be one of them, but they probably glance at the front, but they then move on to their next set of interests. What I'm saying is that the New York Times, not only one, has time invested, but it gives you the distilled judgment of what the New York Times editors and staff believe you need to know today. That, I find, a value that is undervalued. That is something that I appreciate, because from my perspective it gives me a broader view, and it saves me time having to go look all over the place for it. I look at other websites too. I look at news, websites that aren't news. One of your Randy's colleagues is a fellow fan of the Tennessee volunteer football team. I check them out regularly, But my point is that the New York Times doesn't say anything about Tennessee, so I go look for them. But I don't want, personally, I believe I am better served by having this body of professionals telling me what's going on that's important than by scouring the web for it myself or hoping that somebody's going to, send it to me.
Nicco, final word. A lot of pressure on you.
Well, one thing I was serious when I opened and said that I think this is one of the most exciting times ever for journalism. I think you can discover and learn more about the world. You can hold power accountable more readily. You can do a wide range of things that would have been a lot more difficult to learn about, to discover, to do 25 or 30 years ago. And what's really exciting to me is the future and where we might go here in the long term, and video games.
So we'll end with video games. I want you to remember that as the final word. Thank you guys very much. Congratulations.